Guys, how's it going? TJ here with Dead History, and I'm here today with Henry.
Hello.
And today is our next Vice Presidential Series installment, and we're taking a look at what number, Henry?
The 31st Vice President of the United States, Charles Curtis?
Curtis, you got it? You don't doubt yourself. The 31st Vice President of the United States, the man behind us, Charles Curtis. Some very cool things to tell you about Curtis, but first, before we get into our 31st Vice President, Henry, what do the people have to do?
Hit subscribe down below, leave all your comments, questions, drop a like, give a thumbs up, and hit that
Notification bell. There you go, you got it. So there you go. Subscribe. Give us all the comments and questions. We love those. Leave those for us. Hit the like and the thumbs up, and of course the little notification bell so you can be notified when we do release new videos. And Henry, do we even have to tell him when is it?
Every single week.
Every single week. He's right. So here we go. Our next Vice Presidential Series installment, 31st Vice President of the United States, Charles Curtis. And this is
Dead History.
Dead History. Hey guys, TJ back with you here with Henry.
Hello.
And yep, the man behind us, that is Charles Curtis, our 31st Vice President of the United States. The cool things to tell you about Curtis is he is actually a member of the Kaw Nation. Yes, the Native American tribe, the Kaw Nation. He actually was part Native American. He was also the very first person in the history of our country to rise to either the presidency or vice presidency to be of non-European descent and basically have, Native American blood or African American blood or anything like that in him. So yes, he's the very first one. That's very cool, right, Henry?
Yeah.
Very, very cool. Can't wait to tell you all about Charles Curtis's Native American ancestry and heritage. We really are excited to tell you about that. And then, of course, he was actually on the cover of Time magazine twice. Yeah, 2 different times. So we're going to tell you all about that. From Kansas.
Toto, I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore.
Yeah, I went all the way out to Kansas to visit his gravesite. So that's where he's from, where he was born. He didn't die there, but he is buried there in Kansas. We'll get into all that. And he was vice president under what president, Henry?
Herbert Hoover.
That's right, under Herbert Hoover. That's right, he was vice president under Hoover. Very good. So here we go. We're going to get into all this stuff about our 31st vice president, Charles Curtis. First, though, Henry, they did the subscribes. Let's see. They did the likes,
They did the
comments and questions, right? All that stuff, the notification bell. I don't know, Henry. Why don't you tell them? What do they got to go get now?
Get the pretzels, the potato chips, the soda, the popcorn, all those stuff that you want to snack, and anything.
Anything, that's right, all of it. All the snacks, all the drinks, go grab them, because here we go. Next Vice Presidential Series installment, Charles Curtis, our, what number?
31st President.
31st Vice President of the United States here at Dead History. Sit back, relax,
And enjoy.
Hey guys, how's it going? TJ here with Dead History, and welcome to our next Vice Presidential Series installment as we're taking a look at the 31st Vice President of the United States, Charles Curtis. I hope you enjoyed our little intro videos, of course, me and Henry, as always. And today I am flying solo for the audio portion. So it'll just be me reading along here. And of course, part 1, we're going to take a look at the early life, the early educational career and all that stuff, early political career, all the things that we usually look at for every one of our vice presidents in part 1. So, without further ado, as they say, let's just jump right in. Let's jump right in and let's get to it. Here we go. The 31st Vice President of the United States, Charles Curtis. His politics were always purely personal. Issues never bothered him. William Allen White. In the spring of 1932, George and Ira Gershwin's Broadway musical of Thee I Sing spoofed Washington politics, including a vice president named Alexander Throttlebottom, who could get inside the White House only on public tours. The tour guide, who failed to recognize Throttlebottom, at one point engaged him in a discussion of the Vice Presidency. Guide: well, how did he come to be Vice President? Throttlebottom: well, they put a lot of names in a hat and he lost. Guide: what does he do all the time? Throttlebottom: well, he sits in the park and feeds the peanuts to the pigeons and the squirrels, and then he takes walks and goes to the movies. Last week, he tried to join the library, but he needed 2 references, so he couldn't get in. Audiences laughed heartily at these lines, in part because they could easily identify the hapless Throttlebottom with the incumbent vice president, Charles Curtis. Curtis was never close to President Herbert Hoover and played no significant role in his administration. Despite Curtis's many years of his experience as a member of the House and Senate and as Senate Majority Leader, his counsel was rarely sought on legislative matters. His chief notoriety as vice president came as a result of a messy social squabble over protocol, which only made him appear ridiculous. Many Republicans hoped to dump Curtis from the ticket when Hoover ran for re-election. Given Curtis's Horatio Alger-style rise in life and his long and successful career in Congress, how did he become such a Throttlebottom as vice president? Formative years on the reservation. Although colorful in itself, Charles Curtis's actual life story often became obscured by its political mythology. He began life in 1860 in North Topeka, Kansas, where he spent his earliest years partly in the white and partly in the Native American community. The son of Orrin Curtis, a white man, and Ellen Pappan, who was 1/4 Kaw Indian, Charles Curtis, on his mother's side, was the great-great-grandson of White Plume, a Kansas Kaw chief who had offered assistance to the Lewis and Clark expedition in 1804. White Plume's daughter married Louis Gonville, a French-Canadian fur trader, and their daughter, Julie Gonville, married Louis Pappan. As a result of the Kansas Kaw Treaty of 1825, the tribe relinquished its claims to its traditional lands in Missouri and Kansas. A 2 million acre reservation was established west of Topeka for full-blooded Indians, while a series of fee simple land grants along the Kansas River were set aside for half-breeds, those who had intermarried with whites. Curtis's grandmother, Julie Gonville Pappan, received half-breed reservation number 4, half-breed reservation number 4, directly across the river from the Kansas capital, where she and her husband ran a profitable ferry business. Reflecting his mother's heritage, Charles Curtis spoke French and Kansa before he learned English. His mother died in 1863, about the time that his father left to fight in the Civil War. Soon thereafter, Orrin Curtis remarried, divorced, remarried again, and was dishonorably discharged from the Union Army. At the end of the war, Curtis was court-martialed for having hanged 3 prisoners in his custody, or as the charges read, for executing the bushwhackers. Sentenced to a year's hard labor at the Missouri State Penitentiary, he was pardoned a month later and returned to Kansas. Given Orrin's unstable circumstances and roving nature, young Charley remained in the custody of his paternal grandparents. In 1865, his maternal grandparents, Louis and Julie Papin Gonville, left North Topeka to return to the Kaw Reservation at Council Grove, concerned that otherwise they might be excluded from future land settlements and compensation. The next year, young Charley went to live with them on the reservation. Since Charley could speak the Kaw language, he fit comfortably into the tribe. "I had my bows and arrows," he later recalled, and joined the other boys in shooting arrows at nickels, dimes, and quarters, which visitors would place in split sticks. In those still frontier days, the Kaw Reservation was frequently raided by nomadic Cheyenne Indians, and during one attack, Charley was sent on a mission to inform Topeka. "I volunteered to make the trip," he later told audiences. "When we heard the Cheyennes were coming, the horses and ponies were driven to pasture, some distance from my grandpa's home, so there was no horse or pony to ride. I therefore started out on foot, traveling during the night. The next day, he arrived in Topeka, some 60 miles away. Curtis's cross-country run made him a celebrity in North Topeka, but the incident also convinced his paternal grandparents, William and Permelia Curtis, that their grandson should be raised in the more civilized atmosphere of Topeka rather than return to the reservation. Curtis had learned to ride Indian ponies bareback and won a reputation as a good and fearless rider. Back in North Topeka, his grandfather, William Curtis, had built a racetrack, and in 1869, Charles Curtis rode in his first race. He soon became a full-fledged jockey and continued to ride until 1876. A fellow jockey described Curtis as rather short and wiry, and just another brush boy jockey, explaining that Eastern riders called us brush boys because we rode in what would be called the sticks. As a winning jockey, Curtis was known throughout Kansas as the Indian Boy. His mounts made a lot of money for the local gamblers and prostitutes who bet on him, and he recalled that after one race, a madam bought him a new suit of clothes, boots, hat, and all, and had a new jockey suit made for him. Others bought him candy and presents. "I had never been so petted in my life, and I liked it," Curtis reminisced. His family, however, had greater ambitions for the boy than horse racing. In 1871, grandfather William Curtis brought suit on behalf of Charley and his sister Elizabeth to establish their claim over that of their father for title to their mother's share of the half-breed lands in North Topeka. When Curtis's father lost this suit, he left Topeka for good. Grandfather Curtis wanted Charley to stop racing and go back to school, but after his grandfather's death in 1873, the boy set out to join his other grandparents, Louis and Julie Papin, who were traveling with the Kaw tribe from Kansas to the Indian Territory of Oklahoma. Still on the tribal roll and longing for the old life, he wanted to live on the reservation. Grandmother Julie talked him out of it. She invited him to her wagon and asked why he wanted to go to the Indian Territory. While she would have liked nothing better than to have him live with her, she told him that on the reservation he would end up, like most of the men on it, without an education or future prospects. If Charley expected to make something of himself, he should return to Topeka and attend school. I took her splendid advice, and the next morning, as the wagons pulled out for the south, bound for the Indian Territory, I mounted my pony and with my belongings in a flour sack, returned to Topeka and school, Curtis recounted. No man or boy ever received better advice. It was the turning point in my life. So, of course, reading from some other sources, some similar information, but just to kind of give you some other perspective here. Charles Curtis was born in North Topeka, Kansas on January 25th of 1860, the son of Orrin Arms Curtis, a Union soldier, and Ellen Gonville Papin, a quarter-blood member of the Kansa, now Kaw Indian tribe, or maybe it's Kansa. As the only person of Indian blood and legal membership in an Indian tribe to be elevated to the second highest office in the land, Curtis has been the focus of considerable interest as well as disagreement regarding the precise character of his genealogy. On occasion, the popular press in the 20th century described him as 1/4 Kaw, or as 1/8 Kaw, and 1/8 Osage, or Osage. The official Kaw tribal census taken in 1929, the year he assumed the Vice Presidency, listed Curtis as 1/8 Kaw, but in 1940, another tribal census changed it to 1/4 Kaw. In the interim, and over objections Curtis himself voiced soon after he relinquished the Vice Presidency, one scholar expressed certainty that Curtis was a half-blood. The available documents confirm that on the maternal side, Curtis was a blood descendant of Kansa Chief White Plume, who married a daughter of the distinguished Osage Chief Pawhuska sometime prior to 1825. Unlike the majority of his tribe, White Plume came under the influence of Catholic missionaries from St. Louis and insisted that the marriage of one of his nieces to Louis Gonville, a French fur trader from Canada, be conducted by a Catholic priest in what White Plume considered a legitimate matter. The Kansa half-blood daughter of this union, Julie, was raised a Catholic and eventually married Louis Papin, another French trader from the St. Louis area. Papin entered the ferry business near the Kansa Reservation and the future site of North Topeka, where his wife gave birth to Ellen, sometimes Helen, who was educated in a Catholic convent in St. Louis. In 1859, Ellen married Orrin Arms Curtis, native of Indiana, and on January 25th of 1860, the future vice president was born to them on Kaw Allotment 4, a tract of land in North Topeka granted to Ellen's mother by the Kansa Treaty of 1825. Charles Curtis was thus an eighth-blood Kaw with, perhaps, a modest Osage heritage, and by Indian office standards of the day, a legal member of the Kaw tribe. Ellen Papin Curtis saw to it that her infant son received a Catholic baptism in the St. Mary's Immaculate Conception Church on the Potawatomi Reservation nearby. She also taught young Charles the French language and apparently was determined to raise him apart from the Kaw tribe, then located on a reservation some 60 miles west of North Topeka. Her untimely death in 1863 altered the situation dramatically. A few months after Ellen's death, Orrin Curtis married but soon divorced Rachel Hatch. Perhaps deeming it necessary to remove himself from the setting of his recent bereavement and domestic difficulties, he secured an officer's appointment in the 15th Kansas Cavalry for service against the Confederacy in Missouri and Arkansas. Thus, at the age 3, Charles and his older sister Permelia were placed in their maternal grandmother Permelia Hubbard Curtis's care, with her husband William and their family, who had followed Orrin from Indiana to Kansas Territory in 1860. While her husband engaged in Indian land speculation in the North Topeka vicinity, Permelia ruled her family, including her young Indian grandson, with stern dedication. As Charles Curtis's sister recalled years later, membership in the Republican Party and the Methodist Church were seen by the grandmother as prerequisites to the good life on earth as well as to eternal salvation. In 1866, however, young Charles was abruptly placed in the care of Julie Gonville Papin, his maternal grandmother, on the Kaw Reservation at Council Grove. While Charles was sent to live with his Indian grandmother is difficult to determine. The Civil War was over, and the Council Grove Reservation was dominated by full-bloods alien to their mixed-blood relatives in eastern Kansas. Certainly, there were few Republicans and even fewer Methodists among the Kaw traditionalists. The most plausible explanation is that in 1866, there were rumors of an impending Kaw removal treaty, one that once and for all might settle their tribal land affairs in Kansas. With the possibility of a generous financial settlement, it was desirable for Charles and his sister to be reservation residents, thus guaranteeing their legal tribal membership and qualifying them for annuity disbursements. Or it simply may have been a case of the two grandmothers wishing to share in the expense and responsibilities of raising the young mixed bloods. Whatever the case, Charles Curtis lived with his Indian grandmother until the Southern Cheyenne raid on the Kaw Reservation in spring of 1868. It was June 3rd of 1868, some 100 mounted Southern Cheyenne from the high plains to the west appeared at Council Grove and heaped insults on the Kaws with whom they had been bickering for several years. A few shots were fired, and shouts and insults from both sides continued for about 4 hours, but no one was injured. In fact, there was no serious military danger because federal troops from nearby Fort Riley were prepared to intervene in case threats on either side turned to violence. The Cheyennes did steal some food and livestock from nearby non-Indian farms, but they later agreed to pay for the modest amount of plunder taken. Young Curtis was unaware of these details, but in later years never wearied of challenging those who suggested that he had fled the reservation for fear of personal injury. To the contrary, he claimed that tribal leaders gave him the responsibility of traveling alone and on foot to North Topeka to alert Kansas authorities and the mixed bloods of the Cheyenne attack. The records indicate that Kansas Governor Samuel Crawford was informed of the attack by Joseph James, Kaw half-blood interpreter, under orders of Kaw agent E.S. Stover. James, who was a distant relative of Curtis, apparently took the young mixed blood with him on his mission to Topeka and to the less perilous home of William and Permelia Curtis. Certainly these events contributed to Curtis's developing aversion for traditionalist reservation life, an aversion that intensified in the face of his father's enlistment in the 19th Kansas Cavalry later that year for military action against the tribe that had attacked his Kaw relatives at Council Grove. Excluding some hesitation before he decided, in 1874, to stay in Topeka rather than join his tribe on a new reservation in future Oklahoma, Curtis's interest and involvement with his tribe with Indian affairs in general were minimal until he entered national politics 2 decades later. Yet, his name remained on the Kaw annuity roll until 1878, when it was officially deleted by the Indian office for his having failed to reside with his people in Indian territory. Even so, he continued to retain the status of a legal Kaw for the reason that his maternal grandmother was so designated by the Kansas Treaty of 1825. Curtis attended common school in North Topeka and worked on weekends as a hack driver and fruit salesman in the rail yards near his grandfather's hotel. During the summer months, he also rode as a jockey at county fairs in Kansas and at racetracks in Indian Territory and Texas. In 1876, he entered Topeka High School, and in 1879, he began to read law under Topeka attorney Adriel H. Case, or Adriel. He was handling some of Case's minor court appearances, and in 1881, at age 21, the future vice president was certified by the Kansas bar. Criminal law became his specialty, and the Republican Party his political preference, as it was most of Topekans of that time. On November 27th of 1884, Curtis married Anna E. Baird of Topeka, to which union were born 2 daughters and 1 son. Daughters Permelia, son Harry, and the other daughter Leona, in that order. A passion for politics. In Topeka, Curtis lived with his grandmother, Permelia Hubbard Curtis, a decidedly strong-minded woman. She brooked no opposition, recalled Charley's half-sister, Dolly. I think she regarded being both a Methodist and a Republican as essential for anyone who expected to go to heaven. When Charley was offered a contract to race at the Philadelphia Centennial in 1876, Permelia Curtis put her foot down. Instead, he retired as a jockey and went to high school. After graduating, he studied law, supporting himself by working as a custodian in a law firm and by driving a hack. When he had no customers, he would stop under street lamps to read his law books. In 1881, at the age of 21, Charles Curtis was admitted to the Kansas bar. Although his life appeared to be a rags to riches story, Curtis had in fact a considerable inheritance in land in North Topeka. The young lawyer plunged into real estate, selling lots and building houses. He also opened his own firm and practiced criminal law. In 1884, Charles Curtis married Anna Baird. They had 3 children and also took in his half-sister Dolly when her mother died. As a young man, Curtis showed a passion for politics. In 1880, during James Garfield's campaign for president, Curtis donned an oilcloth cap and carried a torch in a Republican parade through Topeka. It was only a matter of time before the popular Indian Jockey ran for office himself. In 1884, after shaking every hand in the district, Curtis won election as Shawnee County Attorney. Since both his father and grandfather, Curtis, had operated saloons in North Topeka, he was supported by the liquor interests, which had also retained his law firm. But once elected, Curtis insisted on enforcing the state's prohibition laws and closed down all of the saloons in the county. He won attention not only as a dry, but as a law and order prosecutor. By a single vote in 1889, Curtis lost the nomination to fill a vacancy in the U.S. House of Representatives. It was a time of agrarian depression when voters in the West were turning away from conservatives like Curtis in favor of the more radical solutions put forward by the Farmers Alliance and its political offspring, the Populist Party. In 1891, William Allen White, editor of the Emporia Gazette, first met the young prince, Charles Curtis, and later provided this description. He came down from Topeka to campaign the county, sent by the Republican State Central Committee. His job was to fight the Farmers Alliance. He had a rabble-rousing speech with a good deal of Civil War in it, a lot of protective tariff, and a very carefully poised straddle on the currency question, which I was satisfied then and still think that he knew little about and cared nothing for. For his politics were always purely personal. Issues never bothered him. He was a handsome fellow, 5'10", straight as his Cheyenne Indian grandfather must have been, with an olive skin that looked like old ivory, a silky flowing handlebar mustache, dark shoe-button eyes, beady, and in those days always gay, a mop of crow's wing hair, a gentle, ingratiating voice, and what a smile. For 3 days, White and Curtis toured the county together, with White making the introductions and Curtis making the speeches. Never had White met anyone who could charm a hostile audience as effectively as did Curtis, whose personality could overshadow whatever he was speaking about. This trait helped Curtis defeat the populist and Democratic fusion candidate for a seat in the House in 1892, the same election that saw Kansas vote for the populist presidential candidate and elect a populist governor. Curtis's upset victory brought him to the attention of prominent Easterners such as House Republican leader Thomas B. Reed, who were delighted that someone who thought the way they did on tariff, railroad, and currency issues could win election in so populist a state as Kansas. Reed took a particular liking to the Indian, as he called Curtis, and made him one of his lieutenants. Following his election as Shawnee County Attorney in 1884, Curtis's rigid enforcement of the recently passed 1880 Kansas Prohibition Amendment brought the young politician to Republican leaders' attention in the Jayhawk state. Illicit saloon keepers in Topeka had supported Curtis's election in 1884 on the belief that as an Indian, he surely was also against prohibition and thus would go easy on them. In fact, he virtually ended the illegal flow of alcohol in Topeka and in 1886 was easily reelected to the Shawnee County Prosecutor's Office. In the meantime, he had organized a home talent theatrical company to stage several well-attended renditions of the famous anti-drinking play 10 Nights in a Barroom, which spoke well of his political savvy and ambition in a state where the Republican Party was reaping great dividends on the volatile prohibition issue. Years later, he recalled how important his grandmother Curtis's counsel was at this point in his political career. In the 1892 election that saw Kansas cast its vote for the populist James B. Weaver and elect a populist legislature and governor, Curtis made headline news by being elected to Congress on the Republican ticket representing Kansas's old 4th District. It was a dramatic victory for the conservative Curtis and a testimony to his remarkable talent for working what William Allen White termed the human side of politics. Curtis always carried a book containing the names of his constituents, which he carefully memorized prior to a political appearance so that he could address audience members by first name and know something about their jobs, marriages, children, relatives, local gossip, and the like. According to one report from the nation's capital, after he became a congressman, Curtis received 1,400 letters from folks back in Kansas in one 24-hour period, and that with the help of a battalion of secretaries answered every one within the day, often including some personal note taken from his constituent book. One national reporter was persuaded that the famous Curtis handshake and smile could convince a stone image of sincere intent, and that few politicians could match his palavering and small talk on the campaign stump or his ability to deflect serious questions regarding the pressing political issues of the day. There was another side to Curtis's popularity, what some observers attributed to a kind of natural wisdom consequent to an indiscriminate fusion of Indian blood and white, at a time when the government's policy of forced assimilation and tribal dissolution was beginning to prompt public concerns regarding the decline, indeed the demise, of the continent's first North Americans. In Congress, the hardworking mixed blood from Kansas exploited the vanishing American belief with dramatic fineness. As a member of committees dealing with tribal annuities, Indian territory legislation, development and exploitation of public lands, tribal claims dating back to the beginning of the Republic, and after 1903, as chairman of the powerful House Committee on Indian Affairs, Curtis assumed a dominant role in the present and future status of the American Indians. He vigorously supported the distribution and allotment of tribal lands on grounds that individual land ownership would promote assimilation and provide Indian families with the means to engage in the competition that in his mind was very cornerstone of the democratic process. He sponsored the Curtis Act of 1898, which abolished tribal courts and established the legal machinery for dissolution of the once powerful 5 civilized tribes in Indian Territory, and more than any other person in Congress, Curtis laid the foundation for Oklahoma statehood. He championed the legal rights of full-bloods and mixed-bloods alike, and especially orphaned Indian children, while at the same time earning lucrative fees as an attorney representing energy companies that were swindling tribal governments of their natural resources in oil, timber, gas, and coal. He also assumed a leadership role in the legal destruction of his own tribe while gaining valuable allotments for himself and his children in the Caw Allotment Bill of 1902. Our Charley. When Curtis first came to Washington, Democrats firmly controlled the federal government. Grover Cleveland had just been elected to his second term as president, and in the House, Democrats held 218 seats, Republicans 124, and the Populists 14. Then, in 1893, a severe economic depression dramatically reversed party fortunes. Campaigning against the Democrats as the party of the empty dinner pail, Republicans won 254 seats in the next Congress, leaving the Democrats with 93 and the Populists with 10. Tom Reed, who had resumed the speakership with the return of a Republican majority, trusted Curtis's political judgment. According to an often repeated story, Curtis once entered Speaker Reed's office and found a group of Republicans discussing the restoration of the gold standard. "Indian, what would you do about this?" Reed asked. Curtis suggested taking the matter out of the hands of the standing committees that had been dealing with it, since it was apparent they would never agree. Instead, he recommended appointing a special committee to write a new bill. Reed liked the idea so much that he appointed Curtis as a member of the special committee that drafted the Gold Standard Act of 1900. Curtis devoted most of his attention to his service on the Committee on Indian Affairs, where he drafted the Curtis Act in 1898. Entitled An Act for the Protection of the People of the Indian Territory and for Other Purposes, the Curtis Act actually overturned many treaty rights by allocating federal lands, abolishing tribal courts, and giving the Interior Department control over mineral leases on Indian lands. Having reinstated his name on the Kaw tribal rolls in 1889, Curtis was able, through his position on the House Indian Affairs Committee, to calculate the benefits he might receive from government allotments to his tribe. In 1902, he drafted the Kaw Allotment Act, under which he and his children received fee simple title to Kaw land in Oklahoma. Congressman Curtis, hailed throughout Kansas as our Charley, assiduously built his political base in the state. William Allen White recalled that Curtis carried with him little books containing the names of all the Republicans in each township and used to mumble these names, like a pious worshiper out of a prayer book, to commit them to memory. When Curtis greeted a voter, he could recall the man's name and asked about his wife, children, and business. He left voters convinced that they were intimates. In 1903, Curtis made a bid for a Senate seat, competing against fellow Republican Representative Chester Long. Both men had strong support from the railroads, Long being allied with J.P. Morgan interests and Curtis identified with the Jay Gould Railroads. Editor William Allen White grumbled that the money and influence in the election came from the railroads and that people had nothing to do with it. When the Republicans deadlocked, Long and Curtis reached an agreement that Long would gain the nomination in 1903 and would then support Curtis for the next Senate opening, which occurred sooner than anyone anticipated. In 1904, Kansas Senator Joseph R. Burton was indicted by a federal grand jury in St. Louis, Missouri, for representing clients for a fee before the post office in violation of federal statutes. Although the U.S. Supreme Court overturned this conviction on the grounds that Missouri lacked jurisdiction, Burton was tried and convicted again in 1905. In May of 1906, the Supreme Court upheld Burton's second conviction, and as the Senate prepared to expel him, Burton resigned on June 4th of 1906. At that time, state legislatures still elected U.S. senators, but since the Kansas legislature was not in session, the governor appointed Alfred W. Benson to fill the vacancy. When the legislature reconvened, Curtis and several other Republicans challenged Benson for the seat. Kansas progressives promoted the candidacy of Joseph L. Bristow, arguing that he would more faithfully support the reform legislation of President Theodore Roosevelt. Curtis turned for help to Roosevelt's chief conservative opponent, Rhode Island Senator Nelson W. Aldrich. As chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, Aldrich handled all tariff legislation and was able to channel considerable amounts of money from business interests to pro-tariff politicians. Aldrich supplied Curtis with funds to purchase newspapers that would support his senatorial candidacy. William Allen White, who supported Bristow, warned President Roosevelt that attorneys for every railroad in the state were for Curtis. Two railroad attorneys, when I asked them why they were for Curtis, frankly told me in confidence of friendship that orders came from higher up to be for Curtis, and they are obeying orders, White wrote to the president. But Roosevelt seemed less concerned, assuring White that So far, my experience with Curtis has been rather more pleasant than with the average of his colleagues. With his shabby hat, ruffled trousers, and generally unkempt look, Charley, as both his supporters and critics often called him, preferred to work behind the scenes. For him, formal debate on the House floor was a waste of time, and more important, confusing to the public who neither knew nor could understand the inner workings of politics. Getting things done with a slap on the back and the sealing of a deal without a fuss in committee were the more efficient and productive tactics of democracy in action. As a fixer, concluded one Washington reporter shortly after the call allotment business had been completed and Oklahoma statehood was a sure thing, Curtis clearly was one of the best in the business. The fact is that Curtis was a conservative, Republican regular who during the populist and progressive eras was able by sheer power of personalized politics to ignore important economic and social issues. He furthered his political career by appearing to be a concerned protector of high tariffs and hard money against the threat of foreign competition, and he evoked the enduring nature of the capitalistic dream. He stood as living proof that an Indian could succeed at the highest levels of government, and when all else failed, he was not above waving the bloody shirt to remind his constituents that Lincoln, the Republican Party, and Jayhawk soldiers like his father had saved the Union from Democratic slavemongers in his beloved home state of Kansas. Curtis remained in the U.S. House until 1907 when he was selected to fill the unexpired term of Kansas Senator Joseph R. Burton. He was returned to the Senate in 1914, where he served continuously till he became vice president in 1929. With his abiding interest in party organization and parliamentary detail, it surprised no one that he was selected to head the Senate Rules Committee or that he eagerly accepted the onerous responsibilities of party whip. At least at the onset of normalcy following World War I, keen political observers were not surprised that Curtis, vocal opponent of the League of Nations and avid supporter of high tariffs, restrictive immigration, and reduced federal spending, joined Henry Cabot Lodge, Frank Brandegee, and George Harvey in the smoke-filled room at the Republican Convention in Chicago in 1920 to cast his lot for the dark horse nomination of Warren G. Harding. With Senator Lodge's death 1 week after Calvin Coolidge's election in 1924, Curtis reached the apex of his political career by being selected Senate Majority Leader. A high tariff man. The state legislature elected Charles Curtis senator on January 23rd of 1907, and he took his seat a week later. Just as he had worked closely with Tom Reed in the House, Curtis became a chief lieutenant for Senator Aldrich. Then, in his last years in the Senate, and having outlasted his most powerful allies, Aldrich came to rely on a group of younger, high-tariff colleagues, including Curtis, W. Murray Kane of Massachusetts, Eugene Hale of Maine, and Reed Smoot of Utah. In 1909, Curtis played an influential role in the passage of the Payne-Aldrich tariff, which raised rates so high that it helped split the Republican Party into warring conservative and progressive factions. 2 years later, that split claimed Curtis as a victim when he was defeated for renomination by a progressive Republican who in turn was defeated by a Democrat. As a result of the ratification of the 17th Amendment, the first direct popular elections of senators were held in 1914. Progressives were confident that the people would support their candidates. But with an economic recession at home and war in Europe, voters nationwide instead turned to conservative candidates. After defeating the progressive incumbent, Joseph Bristow, for the Republican Senate nomination, Charles Curtis went on to defeat both a Democratic and a Progressive Party opponent that November. Curtis returned to the Senate in 1915 as a symbol of the rewards of party regularity and the defeat of insurgency. Following the pattern set by Senate Democrats who had created the post of party whip in the previous Congress, Senate Republicans appointed New York Senator James Wadsworth as both conference secretary and whip. Then, within a week, the party decided to split these posts and elected Charles Curtis Republican whip. He served under the party leadership of New Hampshire Senator Jacob Gallinger from 1915 to 1918 and of Massachusetts Senator Henry Cabot Lodge from 1918 to 1924. In 1918, when Republicans won back the majority in the Senate, Curtis's role as whip expanded as he led much of the Republican opposition to the Wilson administration. No one ever accused him of being a progressive, wrote one Washington correspondent. But the feminists nevertheless called him friend, and it is one of the proudest of his claims that he led the floor fight for the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote. Senator Curtis went to the 1920 Republican Convention in Chicago as head of the Kansas delegation. When the convention reached a stalemate between the presidential candidacies of General Leonard Wood and Illinois Governor Frank Lowden, Curtis was one of the senators who gathered in the famous smoke-filled room and anointed their colleague, Ohio Senator Warren G. Harding, as the party's nominee. Curtis then returned to the Kansas delegation and told them frankly, as William Allen White recalled, that it had been decided, the phrase was his, to give Harding a play. The hot and tired delegates were glad to take orders and break the deadlock. Kansas switched from Wood to Harding, whose bandwagon began its roll toward the White House. Harding's election took Curtis into the inner circle of Washington power, where he remained a poker-playing advisor to Harding throughout that ill-fated presidency. In 1923, as Harding considered running for a second term, Curtis inquired about his intentions of keeping Vice President Calvin Coolidge on the ticket, perhaps hoping for the job himself. "We are not worrying about that little fellow in Massachusetts," Harding supposedly told him. "Charley Dawes is the man." Harding's sudden death elevated Coolidge to the presidency, and the following year, it was indeed Dawes, not Curtis, who won the nomination for vice president. Senate Majority Leader. In 1923, Curtis became chairman of the Senate Rules Committee, and 2 years later, he succeeded Lodge as Majority Leader, becoming the first Republican to hold the official title of Party Floor Leader. He did not occupy the front row desk that was subsequently reserved for the party's leaders, but instead led from the back row seat on the center aisle. As floor leader, Curtis limited his role to that of a legislative tactician who tried to keep his party united. "You boys tell me what you want, and I'll get it through," Curtis promised. He was said to know every senator's feelings on any pending legislation so thoroughly that he can tell in advance how that senator is going to vote. Remarkably, Curtis maintained good relations with both the conservative and progressive wings of his party. The conservative Pennsylvania Senator George Wharton Pepper recorded that Curtis, as majority leader, displayed a remarkable talent for accomplishing good results for his party by what in international parlance are termed conversations with the other side. He was unusually adept at making deals. The progressive Nebraska Senator George Norris noted that while he often disagreed with Curtis on legislative matters, he never knew Curtis to violate his word or fail to carry out an agreement. Idaho Senator William Borah acclaimed Curtis a great reconciler, a walking political encyclopedia, and one of the best political poker players in America. Journalists described Majority Leader Curtis as one of the greatest whisperers in Congress. Whenever he took his favorite pose with a short, fat arm coiled around another senator's shoulders, the press gallery got busy, wrote one reporter. It was a sure sign that something was doing. Talk, talk, talk. He would complain to the reporters about the endless Senate deliberations. Curtis believed that everything can be fixed by friendly and confidential getting together. The press depicted Curtis as taciturn, not given to long speeches, and unhappy with the Senate's penchant for filibustering. Curtis had supported creating a cloture rule as early as 1911. He had a poker face that masked his feelings, which some attributed to his Indian ancestry. As majority leader, Curtis loyally supported the Coolidge administration, but as a farm state senator, he strongly advocated the kind of federal farm relief that the president opposed. He consistently voted for the McNary-Haugen bills that Coolidge vetoed. In May of 1928, however, he shifted his vote to sustain by a one-vote margin Coolidge's veto. He explained that, regardless of his belief in the issue, he felt it was his duty as leader to stand by the president. This was not an easy vote for Curtis, who at the time was an announced candidate to succeed Coolidge in that year's presidential election, and who was counting on strong support from the farm states. Significantly, another senatorial candidate for the presidency, Indiana's Sonny Jim Watson, who later followed Curtis as majority leader, voted to override the veto. So guys, that's pretty much it. I think that really leads us up to pretty much his vice presidency. I mean, there's some other things I can get into, but I want to save, a good amount for part 2, of course. So we'll get into more stuff, of course, about his vice presidency and then his death and burial and all that sort of thing in part 2 tomorrow. So I hope you enjoyed this look at our 31st vice president, Charles Curtis, a Native American. Very interesting. Part of the Kaw tribe, which is very, very interesting. It's fascinating because he really, truly was the very first person to ever hold the office of presidency or vice presidency that was not of white descent, basically not of European descent. So a man of, he was obviously a person with relations to indigenous peoples, Native Americans. So it's really, really interesting. I find it fascinating. So that's why I wanted to spend a little more time on this part 1. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for all the support. Thank you for all the likes, comments, questions. Keep them all coming. Thank you so much. I hope you guys enjoyed our live stream the other night with Howard Dory of Plotting Through the Presidents, the wonderful podcast. Please, if you haven't already, go listen to Plotting Through the Presidents. Howard Dory and his wife, Jess Dory, they do it together. It's amazing. It's awesome. It's funny. It's unique. It's informative. It's brilliant. So go take a listen and go watch the live stream I did with Howard the other night for about almost about an hour we were on. It was pretty fun. Some very fun stories. So go watch it if you haven't already, and go listen to that podcast. So thanks so much, guys. And yeah, we'll see you tomorrow for our conclusion of Charles Curtis in part 2. See you then. Bye-bye.